So hi, everybody. I'm Diana Gray. I'm the Community Marketing Manager for UiPath. And today's session is So You're a Developer, a UiPath Developer, What Now? So Chris, if you want to move to the next slide.
Sorry.
Right. Do you want to talk to that slide?
Yeah, today we're going to talk, last week we talked about environment. Today we're going to talk about stakeholders. We're going to talk about some organizational theory. If you forgot any of that from college, I know you'll be excited to learn more about that. And then we're going to talk about 3 different personality types that I generally encounter.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm Diana Gray, the Community Marketing Manager. And today our speaker is Chris Bolin. Chris works with us. He's actually a 2-time UiPath MVP for the last 2 years. So we're really happy to have him here today. And if you want to go to the next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about the America Developer Community Sessions. These are really for you guys. They're based in Canada, Latin America, and the USA. And if you want to share your LinkedIn URL in the chat box, please do. We are recording these sessions, so they will be available tomorrow. And I'll put that URL in the chat box for you. If you do have any questions, please put them in chat. However, Chris likes people to talk during his sessions typically. So if you have any questions, he'll ask you from time to time. Please feel free to take yourself off the mic and speak up. If you have any topics that you would like us to cover in the future, please just send me an email or put that in chat as well. And, you know, these sessions are really for you guys to engage with us. They're on topics that we're hoping we can help with, or the audience can help with. So it's the building of the developer group is really, you know, to bring up these topics and discuss them openly. So if you're having any problems or issues or just have questions about how things are done, please let us know. So today, the call is on stakeholders. We had a call last week on the environment, and that's recorded. And then we have 2 sessions coming up, one on next Monday and one the following Monday. So please register for those, and I'll put the registration link in the chat for next week too. And then Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. So today we're doing stakeholders, like I said. Last week, just to review what we did last week, we talked about your environment, whether you're sitting in a COE, whether you're sitting with a consulting firm, whether you're a lone ranger, whether you're working with a team, whether you have a group of business analysts, project managers, and things like that. So today we're going to talk about people. And I know that's one of our funnest things to do as developers and coders is to deal with people. That's probably why a lot of us did not go into more of humanities degree plans. We went into technical plans because we like to sit at our computers and figure out and solve problems. And sometimes when we get interrupted doing that, it takes us off track solving problems, which happened to me quite a bit today. So let's start by just talking generally about the people that you're going to interact with before we start getting into some personality types and organizational theory. Your C-suite champion, we talked about that a little bit last time. This would be the person or persons that brought UiPath into your organization, who either went to a forward event, word of mouth, saw something on YouTube, some sort of advertisement. They decided they wanted UiPath RPA in your organization. And you want to figure out in that dynamic. So remember, dealing with C-suite individuals is a challenge in itself. Differing priorities, reactive, trying to be proactive, but often you reactive. What's their role in your program? What other executives are in your program that need to be engaged in your program? We talked a little bit last week about the steering committee. What kind of executives are on your steering committee? Do you have a representative from every possible department in your organization you may touch? Whether you're been told by your C-suite champion that you're going to focus on finance, or you're going to focus on inventory, you're going to focus on warehouse operations, you still want to involve everybody else that you could possibly end up dealing with, because not only eventually you're going to expand your footprint, but you also want these other people to know what you're doing, because eventually what you do is going to touch them. Then we want to talk about where you sit within the organization, because this is going to dynamically change sometimes how you approach an automation. So in some organizations that I've dealt with and I've counseled and mentored, are developers sitting on the IT side of the business. Actually, there's three different kinds. IT side of the business. Sometimes they sit in their own little cocoon and they get a business packet, and that packet tells them what they need to build. That's not really an IT side. That's not really on the business side. It's just kind of hanging in between. And then you have the folks that sit on the business side. Now, back when UiPath very early started, back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, 2016, 2017, when UiPath was a smaller company and people were starting to buy into this whole RPA, AI, machine learning thing, UiPath, their direction that they said, and that they kind of pushed and promoted was UiPath is designed to sit on the business side because we're automating business tasks. We're automating tasks that people do, whether it be low-hanging fruit, large cross-functional, like we talked about, or departmental. So it's kind of originally was designed to sit on the business side of the house. In many organizations now, I have a good friend that works in an organization in the Chicago area. And in his organization, and even closer to home, I have a friend that works in even Marcus in their organization. They sit on the IT side. Advantages to both, disadvantages to both. Advantages if you're sitting on the IT side is you have more readily access to systems, solving system, being aware of system changes, getting the security to the systems you need. Whereas on the business side, you actually have to go through the whole ticket mechanism, whether you're using ServiceNow or Jira, you still have to go through that whole ticketing mechanism to get that. And sometimes that delay can hamper how much progress you can make in automations. So you want to make friends of the IT people. What I do when I start my COEs is I go to the IT people and I find out who could be my architecture guy or girl. Who's the security person that kind of would be the whole person, the holistic person that I can bounce my needs off of, and that person can direct me to the people I need for specific systems. And then you want to kind of buy them a cup of coffee once in a while, or a Starbucks gift card, or something like that. Keep these people on your side, because then you're going to find if you're sitting on the business side, things are going to go much faster. All right, now let's talk more about people. Let me advance my slides here. Okay, so if you're a team of one, how is your work allocated to you? Are you given backlog from hundreds of people, and that becomes your work stream? Who prioritizes that backlog? Who prioritizes what you're doing? Do you have BA support? Do you need BA support? What sizes are your business teams that you're working with? Are you in a structure where you have one manager to two people, limited scope of supervision, or do you have one manager and you may have 18 people under that one manager? Approvals. Who do you need to go to get approvals to do an automation? For example, I had an automation request just the other day that could possibly bring me into contact with PII. So is that something that I'm going to automatically say, hey, yes, let's put this in background, or am I going to go through some sort of hierarchy and say, I'm going to encounter PII with this automation? That's something I need to know, or do I need to have a need to know? Because vicariously through that building and maintaining of that automation, I'm going to have access to PII. So who's your approval hierarchy? Who maintains your automations after they're built? Do you? Or are they passed off to somebody else? Because that's going to determine your annotations, your labeling, your PDD, your technical design document. You want to make sure that it's all robust enough so that if I'm gone and I win the Mega Millions lottery or get hit by a bus, whatever the kind of Monday I'm having that day, then somebody else can come in and take my place and immediately see by my documentation that where we're at in the automation and what it's doing, where the break is, what kind of direction needs to be taken to maintain that. And in that same vein, you're also going to find out in any organization, you will find incredibly large gaps in business continuity documentation. Some organizations are better than others. Some organizations are really a lot worse than others. And that's a disadvantage for you, because when you start to automate and you start to do your shadowing, you start to do your defining and your what inputs you have and what systems you're going to touch and all of that, you're actually building not only the automation artifacts, the PDD and the design documents for your own automation, but you're kind of building that business process also. So you want to make sure, and a practice that I make in my COEs is, if you don't have your documentation and you want to move up in our backlog, that means you're not going to move up until you have that documentation. So you want to make sure that people are thinking about the process and mapping that process. Who's your security contact? I recruited one guy out of my IT group here that handles all my security needs. I go to him and he will turn in the tickets for me and do what I need to do to get my security, because that means that that's off my plate. So I can delegate that to somebody else. Who are the system owners? In most organizations, you may have a person that is in charge of your Active Directory. You may have a person that's an administrator over your ERP system. You may have a person that's an administrator or the primary contact for a third-party SaaS solution that you don't own. So you want to make sure that those people are engaged. Those people know who you are. Those people know what we're doing and what limitations those systems have. For example, there's a limitation. We have a third-party system application that we use here that handles all the gift cards. And that system does not want bots in their system. So that's one of those systems where if we ever had an automation that came out from people that interact with that system that wanted to do some automation, we're limited by that system saying, no, we don't want a bot in our system. You'll find that if you're dealing with a lot of banks, a lot of government agencies are very careful about having bots in their systems, not only because they don't necessarily know about bots in their systems or what bots do. It's a new technology you're talking. We're 2023 and UiPath became big in 2000, and correct me, Diana, if I'm wrong on the dates, 2015, 2016, 2017. So it's fairly new and it's growing exponentially with the new AI and machine learning ventures out there as well. So people are just a little nervous about what bots do. And they're a little nervous about bots kicking around in their systems, not knowing how bots can maintain the data integrity or the integrity of the information that's in those systems. Do you need to maintain KPIs, key performance indicators? Do you need to generate metrics for what your automations do? For example, you have a certain amount of time that you're building. This is your build time. You'd say it's going to take 3 days to build. Maybe a low-hanging fruit would take 4 hours. In my world, it could take 2 or 3 hours. If it's a long cross-functional automation, it may take several months, maybe several quarters. So you want to have a good idea of what's involved in that build, how much time, and then you want to measure, if you're asked to measure things like KPIs, how much time is it going to save? How many FTE hours are you going to relieve somebody of? What's your SG&A savings that you're going to generate? Are they going to backfill any positions? Are they going to get rid of any positions? What is the FTE rates for those positions and that cost, that baked in cost, which would include insurance benefits, severance accruals, whatever it might be. If you're asked to do KPIs, you need to really sit down and figure out what those KPIs are, what those KPIs are going to measure. Do you have a Scrum process? I will tell you, the worst part of my Monday, every Monday, is going to a Scrum meeting. And some of you may be great fans of Scrum. I'm certainly not a fan of Scrum because it takes away from my normal process. I don't get a lot out of it. But do you have a Scrum process? Who leads that process? How do you update that person? Who prioritizes your working process? How often do you meet or report with your C-suite or your executives or your steering committee? What type of information are they asking you to report? What's the cadence of that information? When I first built this COE for the company I'm with now, the cadence for my reporting to the C-suite was once a week of written report and once every other week a face-to-face report. And that lasted a weekly report, either in writing or via Teams or in person for several months until the C-suite was assured that my resume said I can do what I can do and I meet the requirements of my resume, but also assured of what that process is, how long it takes to build, things like that. Those are the people that are in your immediate circle. And again, like I said last month or last Thursday, I'm sorry, that you cannot be a person that sits at your desk and builds automations and that's all you do. You have to be a people person in this role because you're building business process, you're automating tasks, and those tasks touch people. And so you need to be able to relate to those people and talk with those people. And so that's what we're going to get into a little bit today. And before I move into organizational theory, I want to see, does anybody have any questions for me? Because remember, I talk fast, so you need to slow me down if I'm talking too fast. No. Keep going. All right. Let's talk about organizational theory. So we have a business process. That business process may have been a business process that's been in your organization or the organization you're building for, if you're working for a consulting firm and you're building for a client. Or if you're sitting in that cocoon in between to the business side and whatever it might be, and you get this packet or this, which I don't necessarily understand how that works, but this packet of documentation that this is what you're going to build. You have to understand that that business process has been in the organization for 10, maybe 12 years. Maybe it's newer, maybe it's even older than that. And so at one point somewhere down the road, that business process was a new business process. Okay. And when that business process, when they found an exception to that business process, over the years, that exception just becomes a part of that business process, right? And sometimes when you're thinking about business processes and that you're automating business processes and you think in your mind, well, the bot's brain is only as big as the information I put into the bot's brain when it involves this task. Sometimes you have to go back to the beginning of that business process. That's not always possible. To find out what all those possible exceptions are going to be, because you're kind of starting over in some of those cases. And maybe some of those exceptions that they encountered have been worked into the systems as workarounds or corrections in the system. Maybe some haven't. And so you're going to encounter those, or maybe some haven't. So if you want to build a robust automation, and one of the things I hate, and today is not hate, hate's a harsh word, dislike strongly, is when something that I've built doesn't work. And so today, when I came in this morning, we had several automations that touch a system, several systems that I was just telling Mason that had a Dino that decided to do some updates to their UI over the weekend and not do any pre-release notes to the users of the UI. And that's their prerogative. They're third party. We don't own them. They're SaaS solutions. And so I've spent the day redoing automations that already have been running perfectly for a long time. I don't like to maintain, I like to build, I like to interact, I like to solve problems. Maintaining is kind of what I don't like to do. And I kind of like to maintain a 90 to 85% to 90% build and maintenance ratio. So the more robust you build your automations, the more you know about that business process down to the nitty-gritty of that business process, the less you're going to have to maintain that business process, the more you're going to do for your organization, and the more kudos and rainbows and uniforms your life is going to be. That's taken for granted. However, there are some different things that go on as well. Trendy word in business over the last 10 years has been collaboration. Organizations have taken down cubicles and put in small cubicles with a little divider so you can look at people when you're talking to them. They've taken out conference rooms and they've put in pod sections where you can sit at a tall table with some chairs and maybe a coffee room or a coffee break area, and you can meet that way. You see a lot of organizations trying to be more and more and more modern in how they allow their staff and their people to communicate and to collaborate. You'll see less siloing, less centralization. You see more horizontal crossovers through silos. Organizational theory tells us that in any organization, if a natural byproduct of an organization is going to be that your priority is going to eventually evolve to be less the priority of the organization itself and more the priority of what you oversee within that organization. For example, let's say you're the vice president of revenue accounting in your organization. You're not necessarily so concerned about what inventory management may be doing, except how it affects your close, or maybe you're not so concerned about what marketing is doing, or you're not so concerned about what operations is doing, because you're more concerned about getting your work done and making sure that your work is correct and that your people are productive. So as you spend more and more time in that role, you become more and more siloed just as a natural byproduct of an organization, regardless of how much your organization decides that we're going to be collaborative. We're going to all come into the office after the pandemic, and we're all going to work together again like it used to be. Well, it used to be the same thing. We're siloed. So you're still going to be siloed regardless of how collaborative your organization may be. You may be involving more people in your work. You may be getting more feedback, which is good. But your organizational theory teaches us that regardless of how flat our organization is and how much hierarchy we take away from the organization, we're still going to develop our own hierarchy, our own informal hierarchy in what we do. And so here you come as a UiPath RPA developer, and you cannot work in a siloed organization. Because if you are focusing, let's use our example of revenue accounting. If you're focusing on revenue accounting and you have to, within that automation, you have to have an input from, let's say, accounts payable, or you have to have an input from your warehouse group on how much in stock you have, or whatever it might be. You cannot operate in that silo of revenue accounting. You have to then cross over. So you become a horizontal that crashes through all those barriers. So you are truly collaborating, and you have to learn how to collaborate well. You have to learn how to respect the non-collaborative or the siloing of other people. You have to learn how to respect the fact that they are still more concerned about their own group's performance and their own division before they even start thinking about anybody else's. So you're in revenue accounting. Do you really care what facilities is doing? Not necessarily, no, because you're not bringing in revenue. You may, if you were in accounts payable, you'd be more concerned because you're paying money out of the door. And a great example of people that have to think with that broad mindset would be your CFO or your CEO or your principal manager or your CTO. CTO is a little bit more limited, but that person still needs to have a kind of a holistic view of how the organization is working. Because those C-suite executives are in that position because they can think that way. And as developers, we often think, okay, my job is to build automations and solve the problem and go on to the next one. That's not necessarily our only job as an automation or a developer. We're solving a problem, but we're solving a problem for people. So we need to be cognizant of people and how they interact within the organization and how the organization interacts, because I'm fixing to break down walls. I'm going to come in like a wrecking ball, like Miley Cyrus says, and people are either going to take that as a good thing, a refreshing thing, or some people are going to be very offended with what you're trying to do. Okay. So I'm going to introduce you to 3 personality types. We're going to name them Nancy, Nate, and Natalie. So we're going to start with the Nancys in this world. And I only say Nancy because I've met a Nancy. It's a fictitious name, but I've met a Nancy. So I worked with an organization, not this one, another organization doing UiPath. And Nancy had been with the organization for about think it was 28, 29 years. Nancy came in every day. She did a series of tasks, the same tasks every day, the same days every week, the same weeks every year, the same years every 5, 10, 20 years. She did the same thing and she was good at it. And people could rely on Nancy to do what Nancy did, and Nancy did it accurately. There were never any complaints or issues with Nancy, except Nancy didn't like change. You're going to have a lot of people like that if you just now starting to develop. If you're developing within a COE, if you're developing for a consulting firm that's dealing with the client, you're going to get a lot of client changes. If you're developing in that little cocoon that sits in between, you're going to get even more than I do. So you get this pushback, and this pushback can be kind of passive aggressive sometimes. An aggressive pushback would be, I don't want to work with you. I don't want to do this. This is what I do. This is what I get paid to do. This is what I've always done. Can you go somewhere else, or I'm going to go talk to my manager. I don't think we should be doing this. Or it's a little bit more passive. Like say, okay, Nancy, can you show me what you're doing? Well, can we schedule some time to do that later? I'm really busy right now. Can I give you some written instructions? I'll give them to you by next week, and 3 weeks later, you still don't have written instructions from Nancy. Can we record what I do? I'll set up some time on Teams with you, and you can just record the meeting and I'll show you what to do. And Nancy keeps pushing out the time. The Nancys in this world are not so much afraid of losing their jobs, because organizations, if you've been with an organization, and this is not always true, but if you've been with an organization and you've been there 25, 30 years, they can find something else for Nancy to do. Whether Nancy will take on that new task and do it, that I doubt Nancy would do that. So when dealing with the Nancys, if Nancy's scared of you and Nancy's scared of what RPA does and the impact it will have on her job, then you are doing your job poorly. Because as a developer, your job is to explain to Nancy exactly what RPA is, what RPA is going to do for Nancy. Nancy, hey, you're going to have more time to learn new things. I know you've been here a long time. Don't you ever get tired of doing the same thing every day? Wouldn't you love to try and learn something new, make your day a little bit more interesting than coming in here, sitting an hour in traffic for an hour and a half just to do the same thing every day? So you want to tell Nancy and be transparent with Nancy about what you want to do with Nancy's work. And Nancy may not have a choice, but Nancy's going to keep pushing you off. And if Nancy pushes you off and starts to push back heavily, you're failing at your job of working with people. So your job is to sell it to Nancy, evangelize RPA to Nancy. You don't have to evangelize RPA to a group full of 30 or 40 people to be an RPA evangelist. An RPA evangelist could be someone sitting down at someone's cubicle or desk or whatever it might be, and explaining what RPA is, how it's going to help the company, how we're going to help Nancy's days be a little bit more exciting, a little bit more colorful, a little bit more interesting, because she's not doing the same thing every day. And sometimes, guys, girls, sometimes even those Nancys will still push back. There will be some Nancys, and there are some Nancys that you will never change their minds of. They will resent you. You will start getting called. The office grapevine is a lot more colorful and reliable than sometimes an email from a manager or from an internal resource. The office grapevine, you may start to hear some bad things Nancy's saying about you. Nancy doesn't like you. Nancy thinks that what you're doing is stupid. Nancy will say things because Nancy's trying to protect what she's known all the time. And she's trying to avoid change. And you guys, you will get that from in any organization. You will meet the Nancys. Then you have the Nates. Let's talk about the Nates. The Nates are the guys that, and I'm trying to take my words politically correct, since I don't know if there's any Nancys or Nates on this call. And I don't want to offend anybody. You will encounter some Nates, and I've encountered Nates in my career of some odd years now. Doing this, there are Nates. Nates are the people that are really gung-ho. They really love automation. They really like what it can do. They love the shiny new toy. They're thinking in their mind, man, with automation, I can reduce my costs. I will look better to the bosses. I will maybe even get it's maybe be considered for some promotions because look what I did with RPA. I fully utilized the tool. And so your nates are going to be very aggressive with getting things into your backlog. Hey, can you automate this? Hey, can you automate this? And I always say to nates, I say, sure, let me put that in my backlog. We'll set up some time, we'll define it, we'll build out a process design document. We'll go over it together. I need these documents. I kind of need process documentation from, well, I don't have that. Can I just throw out a phone? Can I just show you what I need to have done? No, you need to follow the process because we have to have documentation because we're doing RPA. So you'll have the nates and then when you put a nate into the backlog and you don't get to the nates right away because you have other priorities, you don't get to the nates right away. The nates will start coming to you and saying, okay, where am I in the back? And if you were in my office right now, you would see on this wall in my office, I have a board that lists the backlog and it lists the work in progress of everything I've got. And it has up there where you are in your documentation to me, where you are in the priority, when you'll be coming into work in progress, when you'll be coming into next to advance. So you know, you can walk in my office and you can look at the board and know exactly where your automations are. You don't have to ask me that. So I make it very transparent, but the nates will come in and say, okay, well, you don't set your own priorities. So I'm going to go talk. I have a meeting with so-and-so. I'm going to go talk to them and see if I can get your priorities changed around. That's what a nate will do to you. And guys, it's not your job to go back to Nate and say, you can't do that. I'm really busy right now. I'm not going to change my priorities to you, but you let the nates follow through on what they're going to do because you're not going to stop them. The nates want the shiny toy. The nates want the recognition. The nates see an avenue with RPA. And nates don't always understand delays, system delays, security delays, access delays, information delays, the system that we're going to code in, is it really behaving like what we thought it was during the define phase? We've run into some, your selectors are kind of being dynamically drawn from your ERP system. They're sitting there in a floating presentation plane, and all of the tools to work with that data are sitting on the plane, on that pane, and you can't access them except through image recognition, and that image recognition is sometimes fuzzy. Nates don't understand all of that, and nates will not try to understand all that. They don't care. They want their automations done, and you'll find some nates, and bless her heart, I mentored somebody, love her to death, mentored someone from a group, and it was not unusual for her to tell me that she was working on an automation and all of a sudden someone went and complained because their automation wasn't before the one she was working on, then she had to stop and start the other person's automation. Those are the nates, and you're going to run into the nates. And the best way that I've found in my life to deal with nates is transparency, putting it out in the open for nates to come in and look at, and just saying, let them follow through, let them go to your champion or whoever's doing in charge of prioritizing your work, because in most cases, you're probably not prioritizing your own work. Unless you're if you're working for a consulting firm, you're probably stuck on one project or two projects at a time, maybe three or all for the same client doing the same thing. If you're at a COE, you've got a plethora of automations coming in your door and sitting in your backlog, and people wanting to know when it's going to be done. And you may be one or two or three people. So you'll have those nates, just let them follow through. Then you have the Natalies, and the Natalies are going to be the people that are above you and Natalies are more reactive than proactive. You have the Natalies, and they're the ones that, oh, well, this department's experiencing a lot of attrition, so I need you to stop everything you're doing. I need you to focus on this group and help them because they've got a lot of attrition that was unplanned. And then when you're done with them, then you can come back and do this. But then by the time you're done knocking out a lot of that attrition issue, and that happens in any organization, you come back and then Natalie has another priority for you. You never kind of get back to where you were. And then Natalie comes to you and says, well, why are these still here? Why aren't these done? Why are these still in your work in progress? The last thing you want to say to a Natalie is, well, Natalie, you remember you took me off those. You want to let Natalie know Well, we're working on those. We're getting back to those, but we wanted to focus on getting this the attrition alleviated for David, and then we wanted to get this accrual process alleviated for Daniel before we come back to these, because those seem more important. Natalie already told you those are more important. She just kind of forgot, and she sees this in your backlog or your work in progress for 3 weeks on her report, and she wants to know why it's still there. So you'll have to. Natalie's are your best friend because they're going to give you an answer. If the Nates come in and say, why is mine not done? You said you started it. You can say, well, Natalie took me off of that so I can prioritize this right then. So Natalie's give you an excuse to get rid of the Nates. And that sounds horrible. But when you're dealing with people, you're dealing with people. We're not here to change people. We're here to educate people. We're here to encourage people. We're here to help people accept the change that we're bringing in, because we are change masters. That's what RPA does. We're introducing change very rapidly, very quickly, and sometimes unwelcomely, how you say that. It's not welcomed by some of the people that you're introducing change to. Some organizations are great. They want change. They want to do it, but you're still going to have the Nates and the Natalies and those and the Nancys. So if you're going to be an RPA developer, I strongly encourage you to start learning how to work with people if you already don't know how to work with people. Because if you don't work well with people, you're not going to get some of the things done that you need to get done. And when you don't get things done that you need to get done, that's on you. That's not on the people that aren't doing your job for you, because it's your job to help the people understand why you need it done. And that's a lot of times, that's just sitting down with somebody, talking with them without pressure, and just getting to know why they feel the way they feel. What are the really the inhibitors and the barriers? How can we overcome these together? That kind of deal. You never want to go to say somebody, well, I need to put this on my report to the C-suite for next month. So I need to put something there besides what's already there. So give me something to put that. You don't want to put that pressure and have people think that you're telling the C-suite on them. You don't want to throw anybody into the bus. Because if you make enemies as an art, and I know this is kind of, I'm not trying to be facetious, but if you make enemies as an RPA developer, then you're hampering your own efforts to develop. Because you can get a downward message from the C-suite saying to everybody, and I had this happen in an organization, I want everybody to have an RPA automation in their department within the next 6 months. And that's a mandate, right? So some people were resentful for that, of that mandate. So you want to make sure that message, it flows a little bit more smoothly through communication, just talking to somebody, being outgoing, alleviating fears, if that makes sense. And then we have the Neds, and the Neds are just great people. I like working with Neds because the Neds are the people that know what you're doing. And I have a female Ned I work with now, knows what you're doing, commensurates with you when they realize you're only one of 3 people. They have automations in your backlog. They just want to know, will it be now? Will it be later? Because they want to plan their own workload for their team. The Neds are the people that really understand what our automation does, what RPA does, what RPAs can do not only for their department, but eventually to help their people to expand and tackle some of those strategic projects that they haven't been able to get to. And the Neds are the ones that you really want to tap into and use to talk to other people when you're working with a Nancy, or when you're having some problems getting some things done. You want to go to Neds and say, hey, who do I talk to besides who I've talked to here? And Ned may say, hey, let me reach out to this person. He's always helped me in the past. And that way you're not only expanding your network and learning new people, but you're also making the Neds feel like they're even more important. So you have the Nancys, the Nates, the Natalies, and the Neds. And I know it sounds kind of discriminatory to put everybody into one of 4 categories, but it's the easiest way I could address working with the personalities of people. And you just have to be that calm river in that whole sea of chaos. And you have to be the one they can go to, because when you say, I'm delayed because of this, they're going to believe you're delayed because of that. When you say, I can't get to this right now because of this, then they're going to believe that. In most cases, you really need to be that one that holds their hands and the one that educates them, evangelizes to them, and capitalizes on relationships that you've had. Boy, that's a lot of talking for me in about 45 minutes. So again, I just wanted with this presentation, I know Mason next time is going to take us through, and I think he's planning on doing some demos. He's another MVP. I just want to take us through this time and last week and this week, kind of setting the foundation of what to expect when you're working with people and what to expect when you're working in an organization and what to look for and how to fit in and how to get started and how to jump into the pool with both feet instead of dipping your toes in. And the only other thing I want to talk about is how you get your work before I open it up for questions or if everybody's still awake. How do you get to work, the work that you get in your organization? I worked with a group of people briefly, one at length for over a year, but the whole team briefly, that I kind of alluded to before, that gets their work in a package or kind of like a business case, and they're to build from that. They don't get a PDD. They don't get to sit in on that definition process or that brainstorming process. So I just want to kind of, and it really becomes a disadvantage. It takes long to build, and it can be very frustrating for them. So I want to talk to you a little bit. And I don't want to step on Mason's toes next week because he may cover this, but I just want to say something about how you get your work in your organization. As an RPA developer, and any of the RPA developers in my COE, I make sure that we're all, if you're assigned to a project, that you're in that project from the brainstorming session, the definition session, all the way through. If you have a BA helping you in a large cross-functional automation, you still need to not only be continually in communication with that BA, but you need to be in all those brainstorming sessions and those project meetings with all the stakeholders, because not only do people need to see who you are, and people need to know that you're involved, because then you're becoming the one that's accountable for that. But if you're in on those brainstorming sessions, you're going to run into that exception planning is going to pop up in your head while you're listening to people talk. And you're going to start saying things like, well, what if this doesn't happen? What if the system doesn't do that? What if the system does this one day? What happens if the system does this? And so if a BA doesn't necessarily always know to ask those questions, you as a developer do. You know what can go wrong when you're doing your automations. You know what goes wrong when you're debugging. You know what goes wrong when you're testing. You know what goes wrong when you're maintaining. So you know what to listen for and in the weeds when people are doing those. So I want to encourage you, Mason, I apologize if I stepped on your toes. I want to encourage you all to make sure that as you're developing, even if you're in a consulting firm working with a client, you have a client, a person at that client that you are as your POC, or if you're sitting in that cocoon in between, you have somebody that you can contact, and I would behoove you to be in constant communication with that person, not only so they feel very involved in what's being done, but so you're very informed. All right, I'm done lecturing. I'm done on my soapbox. Any questions? No? Did we lose everybody, Diana?
And I don't see any in the chat right now, but if anybody wants to ask one, please unmute yourself.
Ryan Lamb again, real quick. Hey, so what do you have any sort of gut instinct about what percentage of developer roles would have an opportunity to interact directly with stakeholders compared to just sort of picking up stories and implementing what's in the story, you know, using UiPath or whatever? Any feel for that?
You know, Brian, I think that's going to depend a lot on how your organization is set up. We talked a little bit last week about how your organization is set up and structured and your RPA practice. All of my developers, including myself, are in constant contact with C-suite. And because they're accountable for their automations. Ultimately, I'm accountable for what they do, but they're accountable for their automations. And they're accountable for getting the approvals, doing the demos, moving into UAT, moving into test, and they're accountable for hypercare. So they're all going to be talking with the executives just like I do. I think that in the real world, I think more of us that sit in are in developing. I find lately that there are more people that are sitting in a COE. So let's take, for example, I have a friend that works, used to be called the Walmart Innovation Labs, and I think they changed the name of it, but he works for Walmart in doing RPA. Now, every time you go to, is anybody from Walmart on the call? No. Anytime that you go and you do self-checkout, or you go into Walmart and they're changing from the Valentine's Day to the summer or whatever it is, Walmart, most RPA, UiPath RPA, if Walmart didn't have UiPath RPA, Walmart would shut down. UiPath RPA runs a lot of what Walmart does. Walmart has 500, I think when I talked with her last, and that was maybe 2 years ago, she had 500 bots, not automations, bots running automations within Walmart. So when you do your self-checkout and that self-checkout closes to reconcile at the end of the day, that's typically done with an interaction, a partnership between a human and a bot. So in Walmart's world, in their COE, they are directly involved with every automation. They don't get a packet. They don't get a use case. They don't get something but when you get into organizations like the government, you're going to get use cases, in more or less most of the time. You're going to get a use case, and they're going to say, here's what we want to do. This is the specifics you need to build this. When you get into more of a large retail organization, you're going to be more intimate with that whole process. You're going to kind of flesh out the whole SD, software development lifecycle. I think it would probably, in my world, in my mind, in having interacted with the people I've interacted with, I find that working in a government or a public entity doing RPA is a little bit more difficult, because you don't sit with the group that you're building for. You're generally getting a use case and you're building from that. Does that help answer your question? So I don't know if there's a actual 80 or 70% of them are in COEs, or 50% of them are in whatever. And even then, Brian, when you're talking about organization, there's PepsiCo. I don't know if anybody's on from PepsiCo. PepsiCo has a very robust, large UiPath automation practice. PepsiCo has one guy that his whole job, every day, 5 days a week, his whole job is running Orchestrator for PepsiCo. And PepsiCo has 5 different orchestrator instances. So his whole job is he's the orchestrator administrator. That's all he does all day. So even then, when you may have some people in your team that aren't even getting the packets, but they are very vital to what you do. Does that help answer, Brian? I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I was also kind of just like, with some organizations I've seen in the past have things like product owners or business analysts and such, and those people are more in touch with stakeholders, and then the
Correct.
actual developers themselves don't really ever interact with business stakeholders. It's more along the lines of product owners and business analysts are essentially gathering all the requirements and then putting them into stories or whatever, and then the RPA developer just picks the story and starts building stuff using activities and all that.
Correct. And when I was with Mary Kay, we tried an experimental COE in experimental, I guess, center of excellence in our IT. They call it IST there, IT. And in their world, they did exactly what you talk about. They went out and the business analyst interacted with the client or the customer and did all the process design documentation, got all the artifacts up front, and then they gave it to a developer. I find what we found at Mary Kay in evaluating the differences between that experimental COE that we set up there. And the other COEs, like the finance COE, is we had less builds. So because it took them longer to build, and they had to end up going back out after the business analysts had done all the pre-work, and they had to end up going back out to the client still and getting questions answered more than if they were sitting in that first brainstorming and involved throughout. And so when it came time to maintenance, it was kind of the same way. So the disadvantage of the model that you're talking about, Brian, the disadvantage I found in my experience, and I can only speak from my experience, is that you had slower builds, less impact of what you wanted to do, especially if you had a large workload. For example, the finance team, there was one time that the finance team had close to, I think it was 150 or 160 automations in production, and our experimental COE had 40. So you have a very large disparity in what you're able to do for the organization if you're doing it in packets only or use case stories. But yes, there are models that do that. Do I prefer that? No, I do not. Now I have business analysts that jump in and we bring them in on, I have one that just started, but we bring them in on larger cross-functional projects. But I'm in communication with that person every day. And I still ask questions of the client, just so that I'm clear on what the situation is or something like that. Because a business analyst isn't developing. So they may understand UiPath. They may have been certified a business analyst in UiPath, but they don't necessarily understand the code that you're doing or the challenges in sometimes putting a variable selector on something that doesn't necessarily take all the time. That makes sense. So business analyst doesn't really have as much insight into what you're doing as what you do as a developer would. Does that help at all?
Yep, it does. Thanks.
Yep. No one else? No one else? All right. I don't have anything else, Diana. Do you have anything else? I know Mason's taking over next week. Mason, it's all on you next week.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for showing up today. Again, I put in the chat where you can register for next week's session with Mason. And Chris, thank you so much. This was really interesting.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody.